17 years old, thrown into a pit by his own brothers, then sold to strangers for the exact price of an ordinary slave. That should have been the end of his story. It took over 20 years for anyone to find out it was only the beginning. To understand how far Joseph fell and how far he eventually rose, you have to start with a family that was already broken long before that day in the pit. Joseph was one of 12 sons, but he was his father Jacob's favorite, the firstborn of his beloved wife Rachel, born to him in his old age. Jacob didn't hide his favoritism. He gave Joseph a richly ornamented robe, a gift so pointed that every one of his other sons understood exactly what it meant. And Joseph, still young, still unaware of how dangerous resentment can become, made things worse by sharing 2 dreams with his brothers. Dreams in which their sheaves of grain bowed down to his, and the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him as well. His brothers heard the meaning. Immediately, one day, they would all bow to him. They hated him for it. The text is direct about this. They couldn't speak a kind word to him. One day, Jacob sent Joseph out to check on his brothers, who were pasturing the flocks far from home, in the fields near Dothan. It was, in some ways, an ordinary errand, a father checking on his sons and his livestock. But Joseph walked directly into a place where the resentment against him had already been building for years, far from home, far from anyone who might intervene. When they saw him coming in the distance, still wearing that robe, something in them finally broke. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and we can say a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you most. Not strangers, not enemies, but your own. Your family. If you've ever felt like the people closest to you were the ones who hurt you the deepest, this story is going to feel less like ancient history and more like something you already understand. Stay with me, because what Joseph does with that pain over the next 20 years is the real reason this story has survived for thousands of years. Reuben, the oldest brother, talked them out of murder, convincing them instead to simply throw Joseph into an empty cistern, secretly planning to come back later and rescue him. They stripped him of his robe, the same robe their father had given him, and threw him into the pit. Then they sat down to eat, close enough to hear him, close enough to know exactly what they were doing, and did nothing. A caravan of traders passed by, heading toward Egypt. Judah suggested a new plan. Instead of leaving Joseph to die in the pit, why not profit from him? They pulled him out and sold him to the traders. And here's a detail most retellings skip entirely. The text records the exact price, 20 shekels of silver. That wasn't a random number chosen for the story. It's consistent with the kind of prices recorded in surviving Near Eastern legal and trade documents from that broader era for the sale of a young slave, which means this wasn't presented as a myth with invented numbers, but as a transaction that would have sounded entirely ordinary, almost bureaucratic, to anyone who heard it at the time. His own brothers priced him like livestock and walked away with the money. To cover what they had done, the brothers killed a goat, dipped Joseph's robe in its blood, and brought it back to their father. Jacob, seeing the blood-soaked robe, assumed the worst, that a wild animal had torn his favorite son apart. He tore his own clothes in grief and mourned for many days, refusing to be comforted. Not one of his sons, the very ones who had done this to Joseph, told him the truth. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, and began an entirely new life as a slave in a foreign land, with no family, no status, and no clear path back to anything he had known. He was 17 years old, alone in a country whose language and gods were not his own, owned by a man who could do with him whatever he pleased. What followed for Joseph was not a straight road upward. The text says simply that the Lord was with Joseph, and that everything he did prospered, and Potiphar noticed, It enough to place him in charge of his entire household, trusting him with more responsibility than any slave in that position would normally receive. For a while, it must have seemed like Joseph had found a way to rebuild something out of what had been taken from him. Then Potiphar's wife, who had been watching Joseph for some time, tried repeatedly to draw him into an affair. Joseph refused her every single time, even though refusing her carried real risk and no reward. There was no one to see his integrity, no father to be proud of him, no brothers to eventually envy him for it. He simply refused because it was wrong, in a house where being caught doing the right thing could cost him everything just as easily as doing the wrong thing could. Eventually, humiliated by his repeated refusal, she accused him falsely of assaulting her, using his own discarded garment as false evidence. Potiphar, enraged, had Joseph thrown into prison. Not even a trial, not even a chance to explain. Himself, just another man's word, taken over his, exactly as it had been with his brothers years earlier. Even there, forgotten by nearly everyone, Joseph kept doing the same quiet, faithful work he always had. The warden noticed the same thing Potiphar once had, and placed Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. Years passed this way. No trial, no release date, no indication that anyone outside those walls even remembered he existed. 2 new prisoners eventually arrived, Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker, both having offended the king in some way. Each of them had a troubling dream on the same night, and Joseph, noticing their downcast faces, offered to interpret what they'd seen. He told the cupbearer that within 3 days he would be restored to his position serving Pharaoh, and he told the baker, far more grimly, that within 3 days he would be executed. Both things happened exactly as Joseph said. Before the cupbearer left, Joseph made one simple request. "Remember me when it goes well with you," he said. "Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." The cupbearer forgot him for 2 more years. Picture that for a moment. Betrayed by his brothers, falsely accused by the household he served faithfully, forgotten by the one man who could have helped him, sitting in an Egyptian prison with absolutely no indication that any of it was leading anywhere. If you've ever felt like you were doing everything right and still going nowhere, stay with me, because what happens next is the reason people still tell this story after thousands of years. And it involves the same brothers who once sold him walking, without knowing it, straight back into his path. Eventually, Pharaoh had 2 troubling dreams that none of his advisors could interpret. The cupbearer finally remembered Joseph, and he was brought out of prison, given the chance to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, a warning of 7 years of abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of devastating famine. Pharaoh was so impressed that he placed Joseph in charge of preparing the entire nation for what was coming, second in authority only to Pharaoh himself. He was 30 years old. It had been 13 years since the pit. Joseph oversaw the storage of grain across Egypt during the years of plenty, and when the famine came, exactly as he predicted, Egypt had enough, while surrounding nations, including Canaan, where his family still lived, did not. Jacob sent his sons, Joseph's own brothers, down to Egypt to buy grain, having no idea who they would find in charge of it. They stood before Joseph and bowed down to him, exactly as his dreams had once predicted, decades earlier, in a field where they had mocked him for dreaming it. They didn't recognize him. He recognized them instantly. Joseph tested his brothers over several tense encounters. On their first visit, he accused them of being spies, held Simeon as a hostage, and demanded they return with their youngest brother Benjamin to prove they were telling the truth. A demand that terrified Jacob back home, who had already lost one son from Rachel and refused for a long time to risk losing the other. When hunger finally forced them to return with Benjamin, Joseph tested them once more, in a way designed to reveal exactly what kind of men they had become. He had his own silver cup hidden in Benjamin's sack then sent guards after them, accusing them of theft. It was, in effect, the same scenario his brothers had once created for him. A favored younger brother, singled out, facing a punishment that would separate him from his father forever. Joseph was watching to see whether they would abandon another brother, the way they'd once abandoned him, or whether 20 years and real hunger had changed anything in them at all. Judah, the same brother who had once suggested selling Joseph for silver, stepped forward and offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place, describing in raw detail what the loss would do to their father, an old man who had already buried one beloved son in his heart and would not survive losing another. It was the opposite of what Judah had done decades earlier. Joseph could no longer hold back. He sent everyone else out of the room and revealed himself, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians outside could hear him. "I am Joseph," he said. "Is my father still living?" His brothers were too stunned, too terrified to answer him at first. They were standing in front of the brother they had sold into slavery over 20 years earlier, now the second most powerful man in Egypt, holding their lives entirely in his hands. And then Joseph said the words that define the entire story. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." He didn't punish them. He wept over them, embraced them, and sent them back to Canaan with wagons, provisions, and an urgent message. "Bring our father and everyone in your households, and come live here, because there are still 5 years of famine left, and I will provide for all of you." When Jacob heard that Joseph was still alive, not just alive, but ruling over all of Egypt, the text says his heart went numb, unable to believe it at first, until he saw the wagons Joseph had sent, and finally understood it was true. "I'm convinced," the old man said. "My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." The entire family, 70 people in all, eventually made the journey down into Egypt, where Joseph settled them in the fertile region of Goshen and provided for them for the rest of his father's life, and long after. What makes this story remarkable isn't that Joseph eventually succeeded. It's the 22 years between the pit and the reunion. Years where he had every reason to become bitter, every excuse to let betrayal define him, and simply didn't. He kept doing careful, faithful work in a prison no one thought he'd leave, in a house where he owed no one loyalty, long before he had any idea it would ever matter. Maybe that's the part of this story worth carrying with you. The people who hurt you don't get to decide who you become afterward. Joseph's brothers wrote the beginning of his story. They never got to write the ending. If this story gave you something to carry with you today, stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, stories about pain that didn't get the final word. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you there.